Anik, I'm giving you a link. If people ask for it, share it, but you don't need to share it otherwise.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rachel Dukes, and I'm from the Leadership Council of the SVRI and from the South African Medical Research Council. And I want to welcome you to the second part of our webinar series, Building Bridges and Advancing Learning on VORG and VAC Intersections. We're delighted to be able to hold this webinar today in conjunction with the International Rescue Committee. And I want to just start us off with a little housekeeping while a few other people are managing to join. The event is a Zoom webinar and we are being recorded. The webinar will be 90 minutes long. Our online participants are muted for the duration of the event. And for those of you who are joining us online today, while we get started, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you are in the world. The webinar recording will be shared with you by email and will be uploaded on the SVRI website. The webinar will be in English and we have got French interpretation. I'm sorry, we don't have Spanish today. And if you see the interpretation globe and button in the bottom line of your Zoom screen, if you click on that, then you can choose the language for of your choice for interpretation. If you have questions, please write them in the chat and we'll endeavour to answer them all. So I'm going to hand over to Anik Gervers from the SVRI, who's going to moderate the event today, and she will take you forward from now onwards. So over to you, Anik.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Those of you who joined us for our previous webinar will remember that the theme was on why it was important for us to work together. And some of the themes that came up, as you can see in this word cloud, were around being supportive of one another, better programming and effectiveness, better innovation and more solutions, and improved and shared understanding, goals and measures, sharing knowledge, learning and ideas. And today we are going to invite your participation again in a new word cloud, where we are focusing on examples of coming together in practice and linking knowledge, evidence, and practice. So in today's word cloud, if you can add your thoughts on what works practically to bring violence against women and violence against children's spaces and work together. So Liesel will post the link to the word cloud in the chat, and you can, if you could add your thoughts to that, that would be great. Maybe we'll have a new word cloud for the next session. And while you do that, I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers for today. And you'll see everybody on the screen there. So today we have Dr. Kate Falb, who is a social epidemiologist and the research director for the IRC. And we have Khadija Asghar, who's a mixed methods researcher with 12 years of experience on GBV prevention and response at the VAC intersection. And she's also based at the IRC and has another position at the Johns Hopkins University. So as Rachel said, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. throughout the presentation so we can keep track of those and try to answer them live as best we can. And with that, I will hand over to Kate and Khadija.
Great. Hi both. Sorry, the fire alarm just went off in my building. So I'm trying to get outside. So it's going to be very loud for 2 seconds. Kate, would you mind just saying a quick introduction to Safe at Home in the intro slide?
Sure. I'm sorry to hear that, Khadija. So Khadija and I are here to talk about the development of Safe at Home, which is an IRC program that was really intentionally developed to address the co-occurring violence against women and violence against children in North Kivu, Democratic Republic of Congo. And it was a journey of about 5 years doing formative research, designing, piloting the program, and then testing it through a rigorous trial, and then now at a stage for scaling exploration. Next slide. So one of the very first steps that we had undertaken was to really understand the intersectional drivers of co-occurring violence, which we heard about in the last webinar. There's a lot of different shared pieces to that puzzle. Next slide. And Khadija has actually been working really closely with other colleagues to actually look at the broader evidence review. So I would love to turn it over to her now if she might be back out of the fire alarm zone. Are you there, Khadija?
I am.
Great.
Hello from the outside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the business of building. And so this is essentially, how did we get to creating a program? And it brought together evidence from different places, including a project that I was previously part of called Thrive, which I'll describe more in a second, a round of stakeholder interviews with 12 different experts in the intersection of violence against women and violence against children, a mapping of risk factors, both using primary qualitative research that we conducted at the IRC, and also existing reviews and research that have been done from global experts around this intersection. And so we took all of those different points of data and research and used them to build a logic framework. And so starting from the impact that we were hoping to have right long term, and then working backwards towards, if this is what we want to achieve in the long term, what do we need to do to get there? And that framework actually went through multiple rounds of review and feedback from an external advisory board. So from all of those pieces, we then went into developing content. And so this is where Danielle, who will be on the panel, jumped in, and so can speak a lot to the process of bringing specific key pieces of program content together to create a holistic picture. And we can go to the next slide. So when it came to the landscaping review, this was a review that we did to try to understand the intersections of violence against women and children, specifically in humanitarian contexts. And so we did identify over 90 interventions, and so 43 of those were specifically working in humanitarian and post-conflict contexts. There was a concentration of programs in East Africa, as you can see, and specifically in the DRC and in Ethiopia. But we found that even though we did see 43 interventions, that actually only 6 of them were working at preventing violence against multiple people in the home. And so when it came to talking about, right, what is this intersection, adolescent girls do sit in this intersection. And so to assess all of these different interventions the same, what we did was classify them as both if they were working on multiple actors in the home. So there are 6 interventions that are listed here that we found to be working at this intersection already. And it's worth noting that the majority of them were larger scale social norms change projects. And so through messaging that was focusing, for example, on both women and girls, around violence against both women and children, and things like that, that was actually how a lot of them were addressing both of these both violence against women and violence against children at the same time. There were 2 interventions, the graduation approach and Real Fathers, that did a more intensive intervention, and actually their models were a basis for the model that we created as well. So we did want to shout them out. And there's one more intervention which isn't listed here, which is Empower, and focused specifically on adolescent girls and sexual violence prevention in Kenya, but did find reductions in both sexual violence from relatives and sexual violence from intimate partners or other, which were largely other adolescents. So just worth noting there. Next slide. And so we did key stakeholder interviews with experts on violence against women and violence against children. And so the purpose of this was really to understand, what are some of the shared barriers, but also what are some of the shared opportunities that we might be able to address through this program. And so we weren't able to address all of these, but let's explore. Thank you for that feedback. We weren't able to address all of these, but we did want to share these so that everyone can see what some of the key advice was at that time. And so it has been a few years, and this may have evolved, and there's new questions emerging and new areas, which is fantastic. But some of the key things that we did pick up on was the need for shared messaging to target norms which sustain both violence against women and children, formative research to allow for contextually appropriate approach development and adaptation, thinking about the intersection and trying to expand some of the evidence there in the first round, and then intentionally targeting men. And so one of the findings from the landscaping review, and one that we see multiple times, is that even if interventions are gender blind when they're working with children, for example, unless they're intentionally targeting men, they tend to end up with majority female caregivers. So there's an intentional need to target men and to name them as stakeholders in our program for them to end up participating. And when it came to the research piece, so there was a need for development of a joint framework on violence against women and children, a need to expand intersections at different levels of marginalization, and a need to really sort of dig into some of the drivers and understand a little bit better the relationship between more proximal and more distal factors, and also to better understand the norms. So there's been a lot of work done on norms around violence against women, but until recently, not as much work done on the norms on violence against children. Next slide. And so that information was brought together with this, which might look a little bit scary, but this was a mapping of different common factors that were emerging from some of the reviews at the time that were really talking about this intersection. And so in gray, there's, you don't need to know sort of every single factor here, but what we wanted to do was show how complex some of the different factors and relationships are, and how, we can talk about how things affect IPV and affect child maltreatment across the life course, right? So factors like socioeconomic status, childhood experience of maltreatment, experiencing other forms of adversity in childhood, which is commonly called adverse childhood experiences. And, but also there might be protective factors like social support. And there is a constellation of norms, which there's been some work that we did to unpack that now, but in terms of how they actually fit together, that was a very big question at the time. Next slide. And so when it came to the primary formative research that we did, we ended up doing this with 148 adult men and women across both the DRC and Myanmar. And this was an attempt to understand both the risk factors and specifically the social norms, which operate at more proximal and distal factors to influence violence at the point of conflict, so against women or children in the home. We also included questions to try to understand the intersection of disability and to understand the intersection of older age. And so some of the factors which we included here were factors that were specifically named. But what we see is, very much in line with the socio-ecological model is that there's a constellation of factors, but also that these factors intersect with social norms at each level of the social ecology. And so that was a pretty big finding for us, and that there's a range of norms and where they show up, but also that at the root of there was imbalances of power and gender equality. Next slide. So now taking all of that information, what we did was create a logic model, right? And so thinking about what is the long-term impact that we want to have when it comes to this intersection. The impact that we aim to have was for women to be safer from physical, sexual, and emotional IPV, and from children to be safer from physical and emotional maltreatment. And survivors of family violence are, especially in conflict settings, are supported to recover and thrive. And so moving from this backwards, we had a pretty complicated and intense logic model, which we are not showing you for the sake of not having you pull your hair out. But what it meant was sort of starting from there and then thinking backwards, both from the response side, but also from the prevention side. You know, what changes would we need to see to have this happen? And then from those changes, then, you know, what activities would we need to implement to ensure that we're making change? And a key question was, you know, how do we create the program? And so the initial plan around this was to implement separate programming, but actually what we discussed and realized was that wasn't really going to get us right at this core issue, which is that these two forms of violence overlap and they affect families in the home. And so, and they affect both women and children, and exposure to violence on either side, right? Witnessing violence against other people in the home is also traumatic. So we really did want to take two different programs that IRC has that have, you know, have had longstanding and iterative growth and development and refinement over time, which is families make the difference in engaging men in accountable practice, and then identify the core elements that could, you know, were essential to each of those programs that shouldn't be lost if we're bringing them together, and then identify, well, actually, where are there some points where maybe we talk about it differently, right? But actually the messaging is the same, and there's some shared commonality around what is done to help participants along in their journey, right? To understand these concepts and to work on behavior. And sorry, while I'm going to slow down. So just to quickly note, you know, some of the key things when it came to prevention of violence against children that our practitioner colleagues cited was focusing on cognitive development, focusing on building empathy, and working with caregivers on strategies for self-care. And these were not often things that we saw in violence against women programming, but were also things that could potentially, right, have a positive benefit for programming on violence against women. And from the side of IPV, a lot of what is identified as those core activities is around unpacking the idea of power, the idea of gender, understanding things like allyship, understanding how gender manifests in the home and outside the home, and also reorienting, you know, who we are accountable to, right? And so focusing on women and girls. And a lot of that, you know, isn't usually included in programming around children's well-being. And so this was an opportunity to bring those two things together, focusing on the shared points of nonviolent conflict resolution, building healthy relationships, and also building communication skills. And so now I think I'm going to hand it over. Oh, no, I'm not, sorry. Next slide, and next slide again. So going from there, the simplified, so the round two of this intervention, the first round focused on preventing violence against women, and then Danielle really took this forward to think about family functioning, right? And so how do we think about the family holistically and move, not just think about violence, but think about what does a healthy family look like? And so a couple of the key sort of the key things that we needed to change and the key relationships that were hypothesized were that if there's increased gender equitable attitudes, decreased acceptance of harsh discipline, improved power sharing among couples, increased positive parenting, that we'd have better family functioning and prevention of intimate partner violence and child maltreatment in the home, and that family functioning and child maltreatment and intimate partner violence are also related concepts. And so from here, next slide. The resulting program has 18 sessions for women, 24 sessions for men, and family sessions, which are, there's 5 sessions, and so 2 for the family and then 3 which are focused on the couple. And the add-on of family sessions, that idea came from the graduation approach. So we do want to credit them for having that idea, but you know, their program model focused on women's empowerment, and there was family-focused sessions focusing on child rights, and they found some differences in their in the effect of the program based on monogamous or polygamous households. For us, this program focuses on monogamous households, but that idea that there are multiple people in the family, right, and there can be complex relationships within the family, and so that if we're just working with one woman and we're just working with one man, that might not be enough to really help shift a complex family system. So having this opportunity to connect with families was considered an integral part of the programming. And the content brought together, there's similar gender synchronized content between women and men in the intervention, but the content is gender segregated to allow for safe spaces, and that's based on IRC's best practice research over time, working with men and women and trying to find ways to work together. So next slide. And so I think this is my last one, and then I'm shifting to Kate. And so just to give a sense of, you know, what we saw at baseline, there was 56% of households reported violence against both women and children. And we saw that actually it was more common to have only child maltreatment than just IPV. And so obviously speaks to the normalization of violence against children in a lot of contexts in the DRC. We had also developed 2 questions based on our formative research on deflection of violence. And so this is women's perception of their partner's use of violence. And so 33% of women felt that their husband had yelled or beat them when they were angry at the children, and 34% of women felt that their husband had yelled at or beat their children when they were angry with them. And so that's just to say that, you know, we've had questions, I think, for a long time of just what are proxy relationships, right? And how might violence operate? And so that gets us a little bit deeper into thinking about, you know, what does violence look like when it comes to the home? All right, Kate, I'm going to hand it over to you now, I think.
Thanks, Khadija. And in terms of how we took this program forward, it was really an iterative testing process where we first launched a piloting program with a pre and post test, and we found really promising results overall. Some things just from a practitioner perspective that were really interesting were that families deeply enjoyed coming together in these family sessions, but it's also still critically important to keep women and men separated to have their own specific sessions as well. Additional things that we needed to improve upon was things like including different modules around people with disabilities or older persons within the home as well. Next slide. And ultimately, why Safe at Home is a little bit different from all this, you know, long process that Khadija has been mentioning is that it really is grounded in this feminist understanding of family functioning as a primary outcome. So neither IPV nor child maltreatment was prioritized over the other in terms of outcome, both in terms of the theory of change as well as in the research design, which was really important to bring 2 different siloed sectors together. Second, the other thing that has come through loud and clear, as I had just mentioned, is the importance of having those sex segregated sessions for deeper transformation and support, but really also coming together at different times for couples and families to delve into materials together. And then finally, again, just going back to the original intention of really being based off of evidence-based programming was important. The next slide. And this is just a brief snapshot of the materials for practitioners that were developed as part of this program. Danielle and Khadija could speak a lot more to this, and we can definitely post some resources and follow up when these materials are ready for more external consumption. Next slide. And then next slide. All right, thanks. So we finally went through this very long process of piloting, redesigning, and we had a pretty solid program model. And finally, in November of 2019, we were confident that we could actually launch a cluster randomized controlled trial. And so what this meant in practice is that we had about 8 groups across 4 different villages in North Kivu, DRC, where half of the groups were allocated and randomized to receive Safe at Home in a first cohort. And then the second group was randomized to receive it in a second cohort. So we followed up with those different groups over time. And our primary outcomes were around family functioning. And then secondary outcomes were including intimate partner violence, harsh discipline, amongst some other hypothesized outcomes that related to the theory of change. Next slide. Really importantly, from an ethical perspective, it was actually quite challenging to think through all these different pieces. And so one thing that we did is we asked intimate partner violence outcomes amongst only the women in the couple to adhere to different global research guidance. And we also chose not to interview children in the home due to ethical and logistical constraints. And so we talked to both men and women. We only asked the IPV amongst women, but again, thinking about how do we actually capture all of these different outcomes from the perspectives of all the different household members was really challenging to think about. So something to delve into for future research and learning from you all. Additionally, we still use electronic data collection tools and informed consent, and we did receive ethical approval for the study. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that was really helpful for bringing together the 2 fields programmatically and in a research design perspective was to have a primary outcome that was really grounded in holistic sense of family functioning and being deeply centered within feminist theory. And so we had gone through a process with our teams to conduct focus groups, free listing, cognitive interviewing, and adapt different measures around family functioning to come up with our final outcome. And we have a paper in progress right now, but it touches upon different components of family functioning like communication, empathy, sharing values, power sharing, etc. Next slide. So what we see overall from baseline to endline is that there were some small changes going upwards overall. So in our Safe at Home group, there was some increase for both females and males. However, that change was not statistically significant. And, again, we are operating in a humanitarian setting, and there was some differential exposure to a volcanic eruption that had occurred, which led to quite a lot of displacement in our treatment groups, as well as, obviously undertaking a trial during the COVID pandemic is just really challenging. So I think we don't quite have this measure sorted. So it'd be great to still consider, how we can push this forward as a field and the utility of it, the utility of family functioning as an outcome would also be helpful to continue exploring. But with that said, the next slide. Safe at Home did significantly prevent violence within the home. And so this slide, we can look at it just focusing on that yellowish brown bar as well as the teal bar right next to it is the change in frequency in violence outcomes between the baseline and endline by treatment group. So you see quite strong reductions between the brownish yellow and the teal for our Safe at Home group. And that was quite consistent for both physical sexual IPV, physical, psychological, harsh discipline towards a child by the female caregiver, and similarly for the male caregiver as well. Additionally, new cases of IPV were also prevented in the Safe at Home arm. The next slide. And we also had an exploratory outcome, which again, I think as a field, we can continue to improve upon how we're measuring this, but it was a combination measure of co-occurring physical, sexual, and or emotional IPV, and also physical and or emotional harsh discipline against children in the home. And so what we see here, we're comparing the the lightish green bar to the red bar, and we see pretty strong changes and decreases in our safe at home arm across the board for these different outcomes, which is really exciting to see. And just to share that Khadijah is actually working on a much more nuanced analyses and late in class analyses to look at patterns of violence that are in the home to see how safe at home may operate differentially for these different underlying factors of violence. Next slide. And additionally, too, just to provide a little bit more nuance to the IPV outcomes, we saw an 86% reduction in being less likely to report physical intimate partner violence in the past 3 months, a 74% reduction in sexual intimate partner violence in the past 3 months, and an 80% reduction in emotional intimate partner violence in the past 3 months. The next slide. As mentioned, going back to our theory of change, we really wanted to explore whether different pathways had also been changing. And so really bucketing these into attitudes around acceptance of harsh discipline towards women, as well as children, and gender attitudes more broadly. And then 2 additional outcomes on power sharing and positive parenting skills, which was in more of a behavioral skills bucket, and then an exploratory outcome on mental health. Next slide. And so ultimately, again, we see really consistent improvements in the improvements of attitudes. So participants were less likely to agree with the justification of wife beating, use of harsh discipline against children, and more likely to report gender equitable attitudes. What you'll see also presented in these specific numbers, the greener ones on top are the women's reports, and the teal color at the bottom are men's reports. And so what we actually see is improved changes amongst women as well in terms of their attitudes as compared to men for these acceptance of harsh discipline and justification measures. Next slide. And then finally, looking at our behavioral and skill buckets, we also looked at power sharing within the couple, which was measured by a power sharing and couple relationship score. And we saw improvements for both men and women, and magnified for men actually in this case. And then we also saw trending increases in parenting skills, and just not significantly so for women, and only marginally so for men. And that was measured through some different parenting skills scales that we have traditionally used for our Family Make a Difference trials and other IRC parenting programs. The next slide. So now we've been thinking about, we've seen quite a lot of success in safe at home, at least in most of these outcomes, and obviously quite difficult to interpret trials that have multiple outcomes, but we're excited to think about the future. Next slide. So 4 areas that we are interested in exploring. The first is that we saw some spillover actually in the waitlisted arm, which could be due to how groups were organized. But while it's a disadvantage for the research, it's also really exciting from a programmatic perspective that it was clear from our practitioner colleagues that they were sharing different messages, and how could we really work together to advance more of this organic community-led diffusion. The second piece is that overall, there were some lower changes across the board for men as compared to women, and some of this could be related to a slightly lower participation rate of men in some of the programming. And so a question is, again, that we see a lot in parenting programs, at least, is how can we improve men's uptake and skills building in the future? The third bucket is really wanting to dig in more closely with our practitioner colleagues on what were some of the most important elements that they had seen for delivering safe at home, and what was working best and what was more challenging when bringing together the 2 different fields. And then finally, to think about more broader programming from the complementary and inclusive perspective. And so we heard from a lot of different participants that also increasing an economic strengthening component could make for more sustainable change for families. So that's one area that we are interested in exploring, as well as just further magnifying some of the different opportunities to reach other forms of people within the home, such as people with disabilities and older persons, to see how we can better address those multiple forms of violence beyond just intimate partner violence and child maltreatment. So I think that is the end of our slide, and we'll turn it over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Kate and Khadija. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce to everybody our panelists for today. But before I do that, I just wanted to clarify for those of you who may have seen in your calendars that you've signed up for a 60-minute or 1-hour webinar. That is indeed what we're going to do. Apologies for the mistake in the housekeeping announcement. We won't be here for 90 minutes. We'll be here for 1 hour. So we plan to end at 5 p.m. South Africa time, which is 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our panel. We have Dr. Rosina Kamaliani. She serves as a Dean and Professor at Aga Khan University, and her areas of research include women, child and adolescent health, with a special focus on the prevention of gender-based violence, promoting mental health, and preventing suicides from a health systems perspective. Then we have Dr. Godfrey Su, who is a senior lecturer and researcher at Makerere University in Uganda, where he is currently working on the development and evaluation of parenting projects that address GBV and violence against children. And then we have Danielle Roth, who is a program practitioner with a background in GBV, youth and social inclusion, and she's working at the IRC on violence against women, violence against children intersections. And Danielle led the program design of the Safe at Home program model that was presented earlier by Kate and Khadija. So with that, maybe we can kick off by hearing from Rosina what you have learned in your organizational work on the VALVAC intersections.
Thank you so much, Anik, and very happy and delighted to be here. So thank you to the host for the opportunity. What we have done at Aga Khan University as different research teams, that when we identified over a period of 10-15 years, that while we are working, and most of the NGOs were only working with women for a very long time, the intergenerational effects through the women and through the mothers were on the children, and especially the adolescent group, which was completely neglected group. Nobody thought that they need any kind of connection or health interaction. So that group was neglected. So we moved our focus, not completely, but in fact, I should say we added in our focus adolescents' health. And we found that intersectionality was extremely important, because the young girls and boys at the age of 6, with their minds being so young and formative age, can change the gender norms when they become the mother and father, and then they can break the vicious cycle. But as we were working with the adolescent health, one of our program on human development program also started focusing on early childhood development. And therefore, we found that through the parenting skills during the early ages, from the birth to the 6 years ECD level, so early child development programs are even more important than we find the adulthood time when we start talking to people. So there are several examples where we work. So our project on Right to Play, where we picked the intervention with school children and out of school children and worked with them. That was very powerful program, and many of you have read or can read our papers around that, which not only changed the gender norms and attitude, peer violence and victimization, but also corporal punishment in school and at home, as well as the entire attitudes towards the gender and equality was also there. So I think that's something very powerful intervention, and the power of play with working with the adolescents group. So I would say that that's a powerful example. And maybe I can come back later after we hear with other panel that what are special things part of Pakistan and LMIC country as terms of the cultural nuances which we tried to address during our programs.
Thank you so much, Rosina. I'll pass on to Danielle if we can hear from you.
Thanks so much, Anik. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to really speak to the practitioner perspective. I think I've been deep in the program design and the support to IRC's country teams and working on Safe at Home. So I think there are three pieces that I feel like I've really learned over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. And that is that trust building and collaboration across violence against women and violence against children practitioner fields and research is essential. We can work together while these spaces have been developed separately. If we start from a place of trust building and recognizing really each sector's principles and approaches and how well-founded and based on the evidence are, there is space for us to grow and spaces for us to develop programming that collaboratively addresses both violence against women and violence against children. At IRC, we took a life course approach for the Safe at Home program model, but I know other program approaches have had great successes with parenting and integrating an IPV lens into parenting. So it's just really making sure that we have the foundational expertise, experiences that are going into whatever the approach is that's developed. Secondly, I think I would say that change in violence against women and violence against children outcomes takes time. I feel like over the course of the last 5 years or so, we've really seen kind of a focus on how can we get things done quickly, a focus on innovation, which is great, cost effectiveness, that's great. But for violence against women and violence against children outcomes together, this is the stuff of our daily bread. It's our life. It's how we've been raised. It takes time to rethink, to learn, and to unlearn. And I think we really can't cut short programming. We have to take the time to really pause and make sure that everyone has the time to process, but also facilitators, discussion group leaders are trained and have the right skills to be able to put this work forward. And then finally, I would say that individual behavior change is a start, but it's really not enough. We mentioned all the social norms work earlier. IRC's work has really been at the individual level, but we really need a layering of approaches. We really need holistic violence against women and violence against children responses that aren't just working at an individual level, but are also working community, social level, policy level in order to see really deep change. Thanks.
Thanks, Danielle. Really interesting contributions. And Godfrey, if we can maybe hear from you about what else is it that we need to know about the intersections between violence against women and violence against children to improve our interventions and programming. Godfrey, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Thank you very much
problem.
for reminding me about that. So building on two colleagues, I think one of the most important things that we could still continue learning is the need for early prevention. As you have seen from the evidence so far, that violence occurs everywhere, but most importantly, we see that there is intergenerational transmission. And so if we focus on preventing violence before it happens, especially to the children, then we have a high chance of cutting down future transmission of perpetration, even that. And of course, building on that is kind of going down a bit, the concept of violence is preventable. That message seems to be going silent. I don't know why in the prevention community, and we must revamp that. Secondly, I think from what I have seen, the importance of homegrown interventions will continue to be a key factor here. And if it is not homegrown intervention, then we must adopt very carefully interventions that have been tested elsewhere. I think that's critical. And then building the capacity of different stakeholders. We know that there's a lot of research that's going on and we have quite some substantial evidence now, but the implementers do not have quite the same understanding as those who are developing programs in the first place. So there's need to tackle this area seriously, and not just implementers, but also the policymakers and those who are in charge, responsible for funding decisions and so on. So funders as well need to understand the power of, tackling VOW and VAC together.
Thank you, Godfrey. And maybe to build on what you're talking about, the importance of homegrown interventions, or to really do really careful adaptation work, maybe Rosina, you could come in to share what you have learned about the low middle income country context and specific cultural adaptations or considerations when doing programming at these intersections.
Yeah, so couple of things which we learned. One is that in many of these cultures, multiple parenting is common because the families are not nuclear and joint families. So when we work with women and mother, the father parenting role is more punitive. This is also we learned that father is considered as a discipline of the maintaining the discipline of the house, and that discipline is done through very negative or punitive approaches. And if we leave man or father out of this our prevention interventions, then the father continues doing that at the name of discipline, the violence so-called in the home. And also when it's multiple parenting, and if we leave out mother-in-law or the family structure and we work on an individual, it doesn't work. So we have to work as a family, as a holistic approach versus on one particular individual. And involving boys and men from the very beginning is very important. So they are also part of it. Also parenting skills. We found that for everything, from home to the schools to the workplaces, everywhere, at the name of the concept of discipline, a lot of violence is becoming legitimate. And therefore, how can one get to the point of disciplining their children, or be it in a family situation, in a positive way? And therefore, positive teaching, positive parenting. Teachers also use sticks. Corporal punishment is common in schools because they consider that's the only way of disciplining. And therefore, the interventions need to also focus on teaching teachers and parents that how to discipline at the same time, do it in a positive interventions and strategies. So these are some of the structural and programmatic adaptation which we keep in mind about multiple parenting, man engagement, and as well as the concept of cultural concept of discipline.
Thank you so much, Rosina. Daniela, I wonder if I can ask you to share what you have learned, because IRC works across multiple, or in multiple countries, so in quite diverse contexts. If you have any learnings to share around these, either looking into homegrown interventions or doing really careful adaptation work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anik. So we piloted Safe at Home specifically in two contexts that were quite different. We spoke at length today about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the DRC context, but we also piloted it in Myanmar, which was quite a different cultural context. I think what I would say is that what we really need is like careful contextualization processes, and those really need to be built into program interventions. I think they start first with like making sure that everything we do is in local language, right? But also making sure that concepts are translating appropriately. But then there needs to be a process with the groups of people that are going to implement programs to really review in depth what the model is, how the model can be adapted to their particular context. I think especially important for us in the context of displacement or conflict. But then additionally, there needs to be a piece that's really looking at processes, looking about language. It's looking about stories that are in curricula. It's looking about role plays and so on. What are the types of violence that are most prevalent in this particular context? Types of violence against women, the types of violence against children. How can we really target these rather than have this kind of broader catch-all approach? And so we've really tried to build contextualization processes into every piece of work we're doing, and certainly with Safe at Home.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think this is really important as of the work. And as there's a comment in the chat around early marriage in some contexts being highly prevalent, and that may also be related to both intimate partner violence and violence against children, and in humanitarian settings as well. And so these are all important aspects to keep in consideration. I know that SVRI is busy finalizing some guidance around adapting interventions, but also there has been some work out of the first round of What Works research and summarizing what the effective design and implementation elements are of effective interventions that create effective change. And so those could also serve as some guidance, but certainly working with locals who understand, people from the setting where you're going to be working, who understand the context and key entry points, as well as understanding the nature of the violence, is really, really important. And I see Christine has also shared here about contextualization. And so I'll ask that question as well, just to say, please feel free to pose questions, and we can put those to the panelists. And so the first question, I just want to go back a little bit in the chat, is can we get recordings and resources on the research? Yes, certainly. This webinar is being recorded and will be on the SVRI website. Everybody who's here and who registered will get an email with the link, and you're welcome to share it with people who were unable to be here. And we will also compile all the links that we shared to the research on that same page. So you'll have all that information. Then a question from Christine, who asked, given the length of the Safe at Home curricula, were there any challenges related to literacy of facilitators and participants? If so, do you have any tips for mitigating these challenges when implementing more complex programs such as this? Danielle, are you able to weigh in on that?
Yes, I was just coming off mute as typical challenge. So yes, so I would say we were working with various levels of literacy. So for example, in Myanmar, we had higher levels of literacy as compared to the DRC. When we developed the curriculum, we tried to recommend adaptations to the activities in each of the sessions for lower literacy level participants, and ways that the activity could be done, whether using local resources, leaves or sticks, boxes, those sorts of things. I do think that is that's part of the contextualization process. It's going through whatever guiding document curriculum is available, thinking about who the population is that you're going to be doing the work with, and then taking it and thinking about, are these activities, do they make sense for the literacy levels, and how can we adapt them? But we did try to make some of those suggestions at the very least. So there is maybe an activity that's open for everyone, and then maybe for those who prefer to write or prefer to draw, there's also a kind of a second layer that can be done as well.
Sorry, then I was muted as I had some very lively children in the background. Sorry, thank you so much, Danielle, for sharing. So the next question that's come in is, what is a specific way of disciplining a child without physically harming them? Godfrey and Rosina, I don't know if you have any thoughts to share on that.
Yeah, so what we learned through our different programs is working with parents and teachers, specifically giving them the ideas of child engagement into different activities. And when the play, for example, takes care of a lot of energies of the children. So if the teachers or the parents are not aware about channelizing their energies into the right direction, then we see the peer perpetration and victimization, but also at the same time, they are subjected to more corporal punishment in school. So with our work with Right to Play, we worked on teachers, and we were able to share the skills with the teachers and with the parents in terms of using the different interventions of engaging children and adolescents into different kind of activities, be it home-based activities, play, outside play or indoor play, and then use a framework of reflect, connect, and apply with the adolescents group, that whatever they are playing, so they can reflect and then they can apply. And in that way, we found that there was a gradual change. So one thing I must emphasize, that none of the intervention or implementation will be a quick fix, as we all know. So we have to be patient and give sufficient time to the intervention to grow and see the change.
Thank you, Rosina. Godfrey, would you like to add anything to that?
No, totally agree. I think that's the same learning that we are seeing here in Uganda and also in the region. So the importance of play, emphasizing the importance of play as a way to bring parents and children together, and for parents to begin to appreciate that even children get unhappy, for instance, they get disappointed by what the parents do to them, and helping parents to become more patient with children, exercises that they share together so that parents can learn to appreciate childhood mistakes so that they don't punish everything harshly. So games are so important. For instance, a simple game like a tug of war, for when you engage parents, ask them to go and play tug of war, pulling a rope with children. In the end, the parents also begin to appreciate that, oh, it's not worthy, pulling ropes. We can resolve our differences even with children in a more amicable way.
Thank you so much, Godfrey. And I'm sort of quite aware that we're running out of time quite rapidly. And there was a question on whether there was any opportunity to look at the impact of COVID on IPV and violence against children. I see Khadija has answered that in the chat, so thank you so much. And Khadija has also given some more information on contextual adaptation of the safe at home intervention, so you can see that there. But there was one more question. I wonder, Danielle, if you can answer it in a minute or less. And that's from Krista, who asks, would this model likely have similar results in a non-emergency context? Have you tried it in other contexts?
Yeah, thanks, Anik. I can't say, because the IRC works in conflict displacement settings. This model is for more of a protracted long-term humanitarian crises. It's not designed for acute emergencies, for sure. So I do think it is more transferable to a development context, but we have not piloted it there. So we've had 3 pilot locations so far, as I said, DRC, Myanmar, and then most recently Tanzania. But we would really welcome the opportunity to collaborate with others who might want to pick this up in a development context. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. So lots of opportunities and lots more that we want to learn. I just want to thank our presenters and our panelists for this discussion. I think we can all tell we'd love to be talking more about this, but our time is almost wrapping up. And so before we close off, I want to hand back to Rachel for some closing messages.
Well, thank you very much to all of the presenters. I mean, this was a really fascinating webinar and great work that you've been doing, Kate and Khadija. That's really fantastic. And thank you very much to all of the panelists and to the SVRI team for organising the webinar. I want to remind everybody that if you've done the word cloud, you will get the results shared in your email. And I think that gives us much to think about around what works practically to bring VORG and VAC together. I'd like to invite you to complete an evaluation. And I think that there is should be a message coming up in the chat around the, oh, here we are on the webinar evaluation. So please could everybody have a quick vote on this. And I will also mention as you complete it that there is a survey being conducted at the moment by the SVRI to identify priority research questions for deepening our understanding of the VORG and VAC intersection. And so please could you complete the survey. We wish to have as participatory process as possible for identifying the research agenda around VOG and VAC. And so we would really value your inputs. I know we've come to the end of our time, so I would just like to thank everybody who's been involved today and everybody who has participated in this webinar. And thank you very much.